Thank you very much. I'm talking about the role of rural-urban migration in the structural transformation. This is joint work with Valerie Mueller and Hak-Lim Lee in the DSG at IFPRI. So what I want to talk about is that I want to first stress that rural-urban migration is a key component of the development process. If you look at every single country that is a developed economy, there's a very low share of the population that lives in rural areas. And so it has to occur that people move at some point in the development process from rural areas to urban areas. So it's an inevitability in a sense in the development process. That's true whether growth is agricultural-led or whether manufacturing and whether growth is agricultural-led or non-agricultural-led. Manufacturing and service sectors, they absorb excess labor if you have gains in agricultural productivity. And one other interesting feature of migration, it is this inevitable part of the development process, but policymakers are scared to death of migration. And it's been true for years and years and years, and we can come up with lots of reasons to try to inhibit migration. So one of my goals of the talk is to tell you why we shouldn't do that. So, for instance, I found an old article Derek Byerly wrote, which was talking about rural-urban migration in Africa, and the concern there was that labor shortages occur seasonally when specific agricultural tasks need to occur. So policymakers say, oh, we've got to inhibit migration so that there are enough people to do these specific tasks that are needed for 3 days, and then for that reason, we really can't have people in the cities. There's always the concern that you can overrun public services in urban areas. We heard yesterday somebody said, oh, well, it costs 3 times as much for a government in Africa to have an urban resident than a rural resident in terms of public services. That's because there's no public services being provided to the rural area. If you condition on the same level of services, it's much more expensive to provide those services in rural areas than urban areas. And then you can find UN documents that say, oh, well, migration is going to cause unemployment in urban areas. If we let people move, there's a causal effect, and there's an unidentified Tadaro paper that's used to back that up. So just to illustrate that this is occurring in Africa, here are the economies in sub-Saharan Africa. We've just to let you know, we've dropped South Africa as a special case from all of these graphs. But if you look at GDP per capita on the x-axis and the rural population share on the right axis, you see, I don't think this is an egregious use of a trend line. There's definitely a trend towards urbanization as you have a bigger economy. Looking at the economically active agricultural population and income level, this is 2009 figures again. We see a trend line, although I think that one probably is even steeper if you get it right. If you get rid of the outliers. So what we want to think about is what's the contribution of migration to urban population growth in Africa? Well, urban population growth, as we've said a couple times yesterday, is really fast in Africa. It turns out, if you look at the 10 largest cities in either 1960 or 2010, so there's a set of 14 cities in Africa that were the largest in 1960 or the largest in 2010, they grew at an average rate of 4.5% between 1960 and 2010. So that's pretty remarkable growth. But as we heard from Luke and others yesterday, there is a bit of a missing middle. If you take all urban areas, in between 1990 and 2000, average urban growth is a bit slower. It's more like 3.4%. So the big cities are growing really fast. The medium-sized cities are not growing nearly as quickly. And just to illustrate this, here's a list of some cities and their estimated populations in 2010, and then their estimated 50-year growth rates. So these are, you can see they're really, some of these cities are growing really fast, like Kinshasa and Dar es Salaam. Accra is growing at about 3.6% according to I think this is the World Development Indicators. So urban population growth has been fast. Now let's just think about what goes into urban population growth. There are three factors. One is net urban fertility. So there's we see natural population growth of the urban population. We have rural-urban migration, but also there's urban expansion. And so if we think about the difference between the population growth rate, the urban population growth rate naturally, and the actual urban population growth rate, the difference has to be accounted for by migration and this growth of urban areas. So we used a data set called the Global Rural Urban Migration Project to estimate how fast migration must be. They've basically held urban areas constant, the growth of urban areas constant, to measure populations in both 1990 and 2000. And we're going to argue that actually we get an estimated growth, a weighted average of 1.07% for Africa in terms of rural-urban migration, based on that data set, holding urban expansion constant. And what I want to argue to you is that that's actually slow. And that's because it's slow, it's hard to study. And as a result, it's actually very difficult. It's not thought about very much in national statistics, and that's part of the argument I want to make. We're also going to argue that encouraging more rural-urban migration, for several reasons that have come up, could enhance growth more. And in many countries, although Ghana is going to be an exception, as I'm going to show, at least there are big partial returns to moving people out of the agricultural sector. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is some ways that policy is really hindering migration, and how getting rid of some of those policies could lead to more migration. It might not, but it could at least it could at least stop hindering migration. Okay, so this 1.07% we estimate is weighted, and that holds urban areas constant. And what we find is actually that some countries had negative rural-urban migration rates. So they're re-ruralizing between 1990 and 2000. A couple of examples are Cote d'Ivoire and Zambia, and you can find articles in the demographics literature on this. Zambia is likely due to the copper bust in the 1990s, so minerals have something to do with the story that I'm going to avoid. The growth rates are sort of remarkably constant across. I categorize them into four groups. Negative growth rates there are 10 countries that actually had negative growth rates. Some of them were very small, but negative. Below average are those between 0 and 1.07%. Above average are 1.07 to 2%, and there were a few countries that really had fast migration rates. And you can see it's about 10 to 12 in each of these categories. Okay, so the reason I say that it's difficult, okay, let's talk about this for a minute. The reason I say it's difficult to study in terms of a national survey is consider the following. Consider you're going out and you're going to do a 5,000 household survey, and you want to know about migration in the past 5 years, okay? And you've got an 80% rural population, which is a little bit of, let's go to the average in 2000, which was more like 70%, okay? So 5,000 households times 70% is going to be 3,500, right? 3,500 means, and let's say that the average household size is 6. That's probably a little small for Africa, but most of my work's on China where it's less than 4. So 6 times 3,500 is what? It's 19,000, something like that, right? So call it 20,000 just for kicks. So we have 20,000 rural residents, and if 1% of them are leaving every year, you're going to have 20,000, 2,000, about 1,000 migrants in your sample, right? Over the past 5 years. And that's all right, but as soon as you start breaking that down into demographic categories and everything, you're going to get a very small number of individuals who are migrants. And that's going to actually be hard to study in that context. And remember, a lot of the countries here have less migration than that. And finally, there's another issue, which is clustering. You cluster your household surveys because you don't want to randomly go to households all over a country. And that means that the standard error on that estimate, that really rough estimate I just gave you, is really big. So you run the risk of having almost no migrants in your sample if you don't do something about that. So what's the upshot? You know, we leave it out of the surveys because we don't really want to know, we don't need to know about it, except in places where migration is really important, like say the Cays area or in Senegal, and actually Mozambique is another example of a country with really fast migration. Okay, so looking at the migration rates so one thing I want to show you is there some real potential? Well, here's the rural population share in 2000, and then migration rates are over here, and you see there are a lot of countries above 0.6. There are a few countries below 0.6, but you know, 60% of the population is living in rural areas, and you see migration rates kind of all over the map. There's no real obvious relationship, at least above that 0.6. Okay, so we don't learn about migration in surveys. We need specialized migration surveys to learn about internal migration as a result, and there are some examples of those. Jean-Francois is going to talk about one in a few minutes, which is the Kagera study. We did a migration tracking study in Ethiopia a few years back. But one thing that comes up is it's just there's some real difficulty in actually designing one of these things, in part because it's so hard to actually find the migrants. Even if you start with a pretty big survey, 5,000 households. And as a result, we don't see the migration modules. There aren't that many specialized migration surveys out there. And so it's kind of difficult to learn just basic facts about migration in Africa as a result. It's difficult to learn about, particularly about linkages to rural areas and even major sources of migrants. So I think one thing I'm calling for is more qualitative work on knowing, you know, what areas of countries are leading to more migration. You know, where are the pockets where people are leaving? Would actually help this line of inquiry. Okay, so I'm going to make I'm going to show you the potential, the partial equilibrium potential is what I want to call it, at least for some migration, with some. I'm going to put some real qualifications on what I'm about to do. I'm going to just say the economy has two sectors, agriculture and then other, and we'll call agriculture rural and everything else urban, which is a gross oversimplification. And then what we'd like to see is if the average returns are equal in the two sectors, the percent of labor in agriculture should be equal to ag GDP over GDP. So I'm going to put a 45-degree line, and this is clearly an oversimplification, but so what we should think of is that countries that are sort of close to the 45-degree line, you know, there isn't that much potential for rural to urban migration. But what we actually have are a lot of countries that are way down here. Okay, so this group of countries, and you can't really see this on the graph, are countries where you have 50, 60, 70% of the population living in rural areas, and less than 20% of GDP is coming from agriculture. Okay, so we're looking at a ratio of 0.4, and that implies that there's a big gap in. This is essentially what Maggie was saying yesterday, or Danny was saying yesterday, that you have this big gap. This is just a different way of looking at that gap between returns in agriculture versus returns in other sectors. Just to give you a couple of examples of countries, I know you can't read this very well, but Ghana is right here. So it's actually remarkably close to that 45-degree line, which would imply there isn't as much potential in Ghana from this perspective. As an alternative, look at Senegal here, where you have more than 50% of the population in rural areas and 15% of GDP is generated in agriculture. Or Togo here is up at 75% and 15%. So there are some real, what I'm claiming is there are some real imbalances in just moving some people even into the informal sector. You probably are going to boost them up in those cases instead of down, like Ravi was talking about yesterday. Okay, so can migration positively affect growth? There are a few different ways. One is if you get agglomeration economies going. We've talked about that. Migration potentially enhances urban productivity if agglomeration economies are present. Second, as I argued at the beginning of my talk, there are relatively higher returns to local public goods in urban areas. Sure, it's 3 times as expensive on average to provide services to urban residents as rural residents, but holding the level of services constant, it's more expensive to build lots of health clinics in rural areas. It's more expensive to build roads out to everybody in rural areas than it is to build a densely packed road network. It's more expensive to provide electricity in rural areas. It's more expensive to build schools in rural, the same level of schools in rural areas as in urban areas. So I'm not here arguing not to build schools in rural areas at all. I'm just arguing that if you want to provide the same level of services, it's cheaper to do it in urban areas than rural areas. So there's an argument for moving people into urban areas. Third, it's not like people leave rural areas and don't have linkages back. So just as we've been talking about linkages in the economy that are missing, there are linkages through remittances, through potential investments at home. There's some nice anthropological literature about the role of home in Africa and how people keep strong ties to their home areas. Sometimes they invest in businesses, but more likely, I would bet a lot of you in the room who live here in Accra and are from somewhere else in Ghana or Africa are thinking of building a house at home in your home village to go back to when you retire. And then there are networks as well, and those networks are actually radically being transformed right now by new information technologies, cell phones and SMSs and the like. So information is going to get out to the rural areas much better than it used to. Lastly, on that point, we often economists love to measure well-being by consumption per capita consumption, or C over N, I'm going to put it. If you move somebody to a rural area out of a house and you continue at the same consumption level, you're at C over N minus 1. So there's an automatic benefit to migration to some extent, at least for rural residents. There's one less mouth to feed. Okay, one puzzle we find is that in several countries, remittance rates are actually low to internal migration. We find that in our ERHS migrants tracking study, it's 33%. It's 29% in the LSMS in South Africa in 1993. And Azam and Goubert find 26% in the Kays area of Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal. Just to give you an example, in China, that rate is about two-thirds of migrants remit in 2000. And in El Salvador, it's like it's also about 65% of internal migrants that are remitting. And that's not considering the international migrants, of whom 85% remit in El Salvador. Okay, just to conclude, I've been arguing that rural-urban migration is actually slow in many countries, and not enough is known about it. And part of the reason not enough is known about it is that it's not in the national surveys, so we'd like to see more national surveys that include a migration module, and especially where there's fast migration. we need a better understanding of low remittance rates to enhance the linkages between rural and urban areas, and that's something that we'd like to study. Just as an example of a policy that would enhance migration, there are labor market rigidities in several countries. There are policies that inhibit migration. And I just want to give one last anecdote. In doing survey work in Mozambique, we found that labor market policy really hindered our ability to hire people. We couldn't fire them if they weren't good enumerators. We couldn't sign them to a contract until the day we were going to take them out into the field. Because if we signed them to a contract before that, before we trained them, forget it. We were going to have to pay them for the whole 10 weeks. It made it very, if your survey work was going to go an additional week for reasons out of your control, you would have to pay them 3 months in late fees or something like that. We had issues with people that we wanted to sign to an additional contract. If we did that, we were going to have to pay them another year, it turned out, according to Mozambican labor law. So all of this actually likely hindered the amount of employment our survey generated for Mozambique, in part because we had to be very careful about tiptoeing around labor laws. If that wasn't there, if those weren't there, we could have hired people much more easily and freely, and likely for longer time periods. Thank you.